officially now. Eh, So I'm sure most likely I'll be the one to administer it unless there's something else comes up on the Friday. But Friday will work either way, even if Dr. Hilwig has to pop in from her other class and get it started. But hopefully I will be here as well. So that is why I typically like to do ones that I do late in physiology, early in MCAT. And then by the time we get around to them, and both repro and and renal are, to me, at the very least, challenging. So I also made handouts, and it didn't print well. I do not know if you like paper notes or not, and of course I forgot to adjust the paper. But you could slide these around, and I'll save a couple. And if you don't want to toss it, it's okay with me. You can slice off the edge. It went by that legal size because I didn't readjust the paper setting for that, but that's me. So let's take a look and see what this says. So that to summarize kidney, and it's not that difficult to summarize it. What does it do? Basically, kidney's job. There's a lot of jobs that it does, whether it's water balance, whether it's pH balance, but the focal point question of what its most important job is nitrogenous waste removal. When it comes to nitrogen, we have issues. We have a very, very difficult time with nitrogen containing compounds, and we can tolerate a certain abundance of those in our bloodstream. Most of them come from proteins that are metabolized because as you know, we take off the amino group, we convert that to ammonia, and then ammonia, which is quite toxic, to relatively detoxify. We have that magical equation where we're able to combine two ammonia molecules with carbon dioxide, a waste product in our bloodstream anyway, and making it more water soluble because they're polar and the carbon dioxide really isn't, and making it considerably less toxic. And so that's the magical formula of NH3 plus CO2, and basically you make this a carbon with a double bond O, and it's easy to look up the chemistry of what it looks like. And that magical molecule is urea. And we have a certain tolerance for urea in the form of this measure that you see on blood tests called blood urea nitrogen. Typical lab levels, they always change, 8 to 25. I assume it's milligram percent, could be gram percent. But that's what we'll go. That's the first one. The other one that's significant comes from purine metabolism. So as we metabolize cells, we end up with problems that purines more so than pyrimidines, so adenine and guanine. And so what basically the adenines and the guanines eventually get metabolized to by a series of mechanisms is this waste product, uric acid. And then uric acid is converted to other materials that can be excreted. The problem with uric acid, and again, there's a lot of variability, maybe again, 3 to 10, I think again it's milligrams percent. Might be a range for that to be in the bloodstream. You shouldn't necessarily see much in the urine because I think it's metabolized further. But uric acid is, and we get to this, you might recall, you guys will hear it in endocrine again, and you might recall it, Chelsea. This has to do with a disease called gout. And gout's very famous. They used to think gout was all about eating rich foods, and it's not. I mean, sometimes it is. That certainly contributes factor. It's more hereditary based factors and some other factors that are common. But so the big U comes from purines. That's what they call uric acid. Those are principal nitrogenous wastes, and that's really what the kidney does, along with everything else. Blood fluid, as you can see here, regulating blood pressure. The most easy area to understand it is the availability of fluid in the system. It's a system is filled with fluid. If you have too much fluid, it increases the pressure on the vessels. If you have less fluid, it lowers it. And so forever and a day, even though we don't do so now because it's not as easy to tolerate, we utilized agents that basically were called diuretics. They caused you to diuresis or urine. Again, constant homeostasis and concentrations of a variety of solutes. So all the different solutes that we'll take a kind of a look at as we look at this particular portion of the chapter, and plasma pH. And so all of these, urea, uric acid, a certain amount of ammonia, you can see phosphates is sort of cut off, but it shouldn't be too difficult to track what's cut off. So you had the anatomy. Our focus points are more on what goes on in the nephron itself, how filtration occurs, the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which is an elegant part of controls that basically are governed a lot, sort of auto-controlled, but it even generate what's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, which we have to review. And we review it any number of times, 3 or 4 times in physiology. And all of those are factors that are there. Additionally, when they talk about detoxification, okay, most of this is done in the liver. The simplistic way to look at it is that the liver detoxifies and many times make things more water soluble, and it permits the kidney to excrete them. The 3 major organs, and I'm sure I've said it any number of times, that really participate in detoxification are the lungs, the liver, and the kidney. The liver is the principal organ that does. That's why liver disease is such a tragedy. Because for whatever reason, there was an article about a guy named John Phillips, terrible human being, but a wonderful songwriter for a group back in the 60s called the Mamas and the Papas. Okay, great. And and I was curious to see if he was still alive because I figured he'd be around 85 years old or so. Son of a gun. I mean, he died of basically liver failure because of drugs and alcohol and everything like that. He was probably too pleasant to death for. He was a pedophile. He was married to another woman in the band. It was 2 men and 2 girls, two men, 2 ladies. She was strikingly pretty, named Michelle Phillips. Her daughter, Mackenzie Phillips, was a TV star when she was very young with Valerie Bertinelli in a show called One Day at a Time. She was a very fine actress, and he sexually abused her. She was a kid. Low life.
They were married?
No, it's his daughter.
Oh.
As well as cheating on his wife and everybody was cheating on everybody else. It's not pleasant. But I'm always curious when I look up people who I'm familiar with and see why they died. Like I said, hopefully it was unpleasant. I know that's not nice, but he doesn't deserve it. So, nevertheless, the lung, like with the alcohol, we blow out alcohol, a very tiny percentage, like 1 to 2,000. It's a fixed rate, but effectively you were detoxifying. The kidneys excrete the water-soluble stuff, but the liver does most of the legwork. Okay, anatomically, we know about the kidney, roughly fist size. It's where all the processing, the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra, despite that they contribute to a lot of physiological problems, certainly are, it's really just a carrying system. Carrying it away from the kidney, no processing, stored in the bladder, no processing, excreted by way of the urethra, no processing. Okay, and that's really what's involved. The functional unit is the nephron, what really happens. So classically, there's 3 things that we talk about. Glomerular filtration. Glomerular filtration. Tube or tubular. Homage to the Ninja Turtles. Ninja Turtles?
Great movie.
Heroes in a Half Show. My kids dressed as it for Halloween. Both of those many years ago. Ninja Turtles, Power Rangers, tubular reabsorption, and lastly, tubular secretion. But I would add a last one myself, even though it's not classic, but extraordinarily important, and that's basically concentrating the urine. And what that permits, by the mechanism we'll take a look at called the countercurrent multiplier and exchanger, the concentrating the urine is so pivotal because it's basically helps us to retain water and maintain a degree of consistency of water balance without sacrificing electrolytes. So that urine concentration is pivotal. What happens when we review this again, when we do the growth and development nugget, and that's really at the very end of the term. Maybe I should throw that in here as well, down the road, is that when babies are born, this countercurrent system is not present. When they start to use their kidneys, which they effectively don't use, the mom is taking care of most of the stuff. So the kidneys are really marginally functional, but the whole countercurrent system is based on the ability to concentrate the urine and retain water. So what do babies do from the time they're born for a long time, for years, for the most part, until they're basically potty trained, is they have very, very difficult time concentrating, particularly overnight. And it takes a long time for this countercurrent system to actually develop deep within the core, so to speak, of the kidney, which is the medulla. And we'll look at the anatomy in a bit. So what you do, so the functional unit is called the nephron. There's two kinds of nephrons, if you recall anatomically from last term. There's juxtaglomerular, which means they're the ones that are, I beg your pardon, there's glomerular nephrons. I mixed the two terms up, and I'm freehanding this. There's glomerular nephrons, which are abundant, about 85%. They do most of the legwork with processing, reabsorbing, and secreting. There's about 15% are called juxtamedullary, next to the medulla. They start in the cortex on the outside, but they have those really long loops of Henle that you might remember make up the pyramids to a great extent. And that's where we see the countercurrent system and the concentrating occur. So, and again, that takes a while for that to develop in the process of developing from birth till however old children are when they typically do that. And all kids are different. You can find out. People. So effectively, what other is noteworthy there anatomically, and these are typical standalone questions, fenestrated epithelia. The lining cells in the glomeruli are simple squamous epithelia. It's designed that way. But those cells and the way that they are attached have tiny holes in them called fenestration. A fenestration is a window. And that allows filtration to occur because things that can pass through like any filter. Whether you're using a big colander for pasta or you're using a fine mesh strainer for something else. So it's the size, and even then there's adjustments, if you might remember, for things called podocytes, cells that surround that basically can open and close little clefts, so more stuff at certain parts can go through and less stuff can go through. And about 99% of the plasma that goes through it, what we call filtrate, is all of the liquid portion in the blood except for formed elements, white cells, red cells, platelets, and proteins. And certainly the proteins hold on to enough water so that it's I hate to call it sludgy, but it's very thick blood. It still flows, but it's thick. And in a matter of seconds to minutes, the filtration and the reabsorption and secretion process occurs as well as the concentration process, depending on the location. And almost immediately, at 99% of that fluid is reabsorbed, less what we want to get rid of. So the reality is that what eventually becomes urine is 1% of the filtrate. And for most of us, that's maybe 1.5 liters to 2 liters a day of urine, depending on how much you hydrate. Okay, and whether you're dehydrated or not, but there's an average basis. Okay, so we can go through filtrate moves. Then remember, it's captured, and to me, I always describe kidney as a series of funnels anatomically. Even the glomerulus is like that. So the capillaries come in and the capillaries go out, and I'll show you the diagrams on the other thing just to refresh your memory. And there's some interesting things about that. But once it gets into this cluster of capillaries, like a little nest of capillaries, as the blood goes through that, the more blood that goes through it, the more filtrate it generates. And that's one of the ways that the kidneys have the beauty of being able to autocorrect. You don't have to do much with the kidneys will do it on their own. So as long as your blood pressure is fairly normal, you don't have to do a lot. As long as there's no disease, you don't have to do a lot. Most of us don't have to worry about kidney function, even as we get older, unless you have some primary disease. So as the blood rushes through this tuft of capillary, and there's about 1 million in each kidney, so there's a lot going on. Basically, it spits out all the stuff that comes out of it. It's like having a little bag, a filter of cheesecloth, and shaking it around when you put stuff in there, and the water comes out, and whatever else is trapped in the water. Interestingly, for someone of Italian descent, it's how they make a ricotta. You should know that. Ricotta means recooked. Okay.
I don't really use ricotta.
Ricotta. Correct. I don't pronounce it particularly well. I'm sorry. That's right, but I'm really good on Hanukkah.
I don't really use.
No ricotta.
No, we use bechamel instead.
Oh, it's okay. Okay. I'm with you. Oh. When we order pizza, we put extra ricotta on it. In Italy, when they make certain cheeses, they have to reuse the whey, which is where the ricotta, and they recook it and extract more. It's the law. Sheep's milk ricotta, cow's milk ricotta. Then you can salt it and hold it, and ricotta salata. You don't watch enough cooking shows. Okay, moving on. So, nevertheless, it effectively, that liquid with everything that's in it, okay, is the filtrate. And then it runs through a series of tubes, and most of the work, as you will see, is done in the proximal convoluted tubule. 2/3 of everything is done there. What's interesting is it even reabsorbs stuff that's going to later secrete to create gradients. So when we get to tubular secretion, which happens more than reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule, it creates gradients to excrete or co-transport stuff that they don't want. So it's very, very interesting. So all of those types of things. So you can see here, secretion, drugs, toxins, acids, bile pigments, and other solids secreted into the filtrate by cells. They eventually leave. So the stuff that we don't want to retain, we don't retain. Reabsorption is the principal area in the proximal, and probably 2 to 1, let's say arbitrarily, resorption to secretion, but much, much greater than the distal convoluted tubule. And so inadvertently filtered out or returned, and then there's a variety of things that are able to do. So reabsorption, there's a lot of energy. So it may surprise you. What is the amount of energy that's utilized by your kidneys? About 25% of your available ATP at rest is being utilized by kidneys. Okay, so reabsorption is active transport. There's a lot of secondary mechanisms, co-transport, anti-transport that occur. And once they're saturated, we'll talk a little bit more about, we do that today again today and Wednesday about diabetes with transport maximums, a really important point to understand because it really is a significant contributing factor in disease. And there you can see the diagram. The first thing that's unique about this system, okay, and so what they're coming in here, some solutes that are not actively reabsorbed are reabsorbed by passive or facilitated diffusion. Water is reabsorbed in a variety of areas. Proximal tubular, of course, relatively permeable, tight junctions by osmosis. Okay. There's a significant change in that when we see the proximal convoluted tubule when we look at the illustrations. It's hard to see it from this without having the color picture, and I have to kind of cut apart the book and scan it, which I'm tempted to do. But this is what it is, and the big deal is right here. Remember when we looked anatomically at the circulation? What makes this system unique, and I don't know of anywhere else where we have an artery entering a capillary bed and an artery leaving a capillary bed. Because typically, when an artery goes through the capillary, the energy is utilized to either do some type of process that's involved in causing materials to be released or reabsorbed back into the venous end. So typically, we go from an arterial through a capillary bed to a venial. So the force in order for the capillary beds everywhere else to do its work, it comes from ATP inherent in the arterial blood, the oxygenated system. In the glomerulus or at the glomerulus, you have two arterioles, one incoming afferent and one outgoing efferent. And the afferent is always a little bit wider, and that's the one that's controlled by that renin-angiotensin mechanism to either make it tighter, less flow, less urine, less water retention. More water retention. And then, or greater, more flow, more filtrate produced, more urine produced, lowering the amount of fluid in the system. So an elegant series, as I said before, of auto controls. What's kind of interesting about all of that is everywhere else. So what are we doing with the energy? Well, the energy comes in after. All that energy that caused reabsorption in the proximal tubule and secretion and some more reabsorption in, because both of these occur in the proximal, and reabsorption predominates in the distal, secretion predominates, though both of them occur, as you will see illustrated in some of the PowerPoint slides. The reality is that's where the energy is being dissipated. So when it goes through those areas, they are typically surrounded by a venous network that makes the transition from capillaries to veins. And you're going to see something called the peritubular capillaries, where it's all about the solutes and the materials and the toxins, whichever direction they're going. And when we get to the water aspect, we play a lot with sodium and chloride, certainly, because that's the principal way we get water to move around. And that is called the vasorecta, because they're very straight and they drape over those very, very long loops of Henle that I'm sure you remember, and you'll see again diagrammatically. That's the easy part. Okay. So as you can see, loop of Henle dips into the medulla. You have nephron. When we talk about loop of Henle, we're typically, so from a test-taking perspective, if I see nephron loops and we're not indicating they're going to the medulla or they're what's called long loops of Henle, I don't presume that that's what they're referring to, but they may be. So that's where we're reading the question, but typically that's the big looping system that we'll take a look at. And so you're going to see this, and we're going to look at the hairpin term, and then they're talking about here the countercurrent mechanism that's involved. And you're going to see that anywhere in that nephron loop, the beginning of it, you have a thick segment and a thin segment. And typically the thin segment is water flows out, and the thick segment is not permeable to water, but solutes can be removed. And so this is what they're looking at. That's where you look at the vasorecta. So they give you an idea. So here we could begin to see, and they're all closely bound to one another rather than stretched out. If you remember the anatomical diagrams we used in lecture, that's so you can visualize it. But what happens here we go. afferent arterial into the glomerulus. Proximal convoluted tubule starts with thick, but the loop, particularly if we're looking at a juxtamedullary nephron, very, very long, very thin, tons of water go out, and the vasa recta are the blood vessels that surround it. And so they're pulling back in the water, and then up here, when we get to the thick segment, balancing out with solutes. And then in the surrounding soft tissue, you're going to see a series of exchanges that occur. One is called the countercurrent multiplier, because it gets progressively more osmolar, higher osmolarity, all the way down, starting at 300 here, down to 1200 here. So you have a tremendous pull on the water. And we eventually reduce that rather substantially by the time we get back up here, even so much that we get hypotonic up here. And all of that is because we're removing the solutes that remain. We just can't leave the situation. That's where the vasa recta come in, and they have something called a countercurrent exchanger. So they pull in the stuff that has to be pulled in, replace the stuff that needs to be replaced, as you will see, without going into the gory details just yet. Fascinating system. And the kidneys are, again, another one of those wonderful poster children for the human body, where everything is fine until it's not, and then it's horrible. You can go from, I never had any problem, my kidneys are, to you're going to be on dialysis for the rest of your life, or you need a kidney transplant because of built-in redundancy. Same thing, you have to be on oxygen for the rest of your life, or you have something tragic, fatal disease of your lungs. I didn't know that until all of a sudden you do. There's so much built-in redundancy. You have 2 kidneys, you probably need an eighth of total kidney function. So if you have 2 kidneys and donate 1, which people do, if you have a quarter of that functioning, 25% of overall 1 kidney function, you're probably doing adequate filtration to survive and to do mostly everything. When it falls below that critical level, all of a sudden school's out.
Your kidneys like the first organ to fail.
Pardon?
It's like if your organs start failing, it's like the kidneys the first to start failing, rather than the other organ systems.
Short answer is I don't know, and not necessarily so. I think it's disease specific.
Yeah.
If you frame the question with diabetics, I would probably say yes. Okay, or diseases similar to diabetes with an uptake in arteriosclerosis or atherosclerotic path. That's because it's going to limit blood flow, but diabetes particularly for another reason, which is autoimmune. I wouldn't make that same case because I think in many instances, just people with hyperlipidemia, it's heart disease. Might be the first organ to fail. There's a lot of systems in your body that kind of, what my dad's doctor, before he succumbed to heart disease, talked about was like little alarm clocks that tell you something's up. So you might have problems in the kidney, you might have problems cognitively, you might have dizzy spells, you might have trouble seeing things, but that's more blood flow, and really the first 63 things you probably should be looking at is your heart. So it's 36 years it will be in August, and I still remember it like it was yesterday. Nightmare. Sid, you went too soon. So I'll go over the structure in a second. This is the concentration nugget. Okay, and I'll go through. So I'm trying to give you these are the important parts. So you need to know, I think, the basics of anatomy and then the basics of physiology. I'll try to amplify it. So the kidneys were not able to make concentrated urine. You'd have to drink gallons. And people drink a lot of water. You all know people. I see 2 water bottles in front of me, easy, 3, 4. There you go. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, as long as, and frankly, I need to do more of that. I went back on keto, and one of the big problems that people have with keto is their kidneys have to be able to get rid of a lot of waste products because you're generating a different saga of waste products. You have to push the fluids. I don't. General understanding. Single effect countercurrent multiplier and exchanger work together to maintain, and it's a poor illustration when I do it this way. So it's to understand how the gradient, it helps to imagine the nephron before it has a steady state gradient. So while reviewing this section, pay attention to differences in various compartments and think about which way water or solids would move if they were to diffuse freely. That's that thick and thin segment. If water and solids could move, theoretically, you'd have the same amount of osmolarity within the loop as you have outside of the loop. It would be isotonic in both directions, not the case. And the other part that's interesting is the fact it's anatomical. You can only have this if you have that hairpin turn, like in Westview. You know the hairpin turn in Westview?
Horseshoe bend.
Yeah. My son used to have a buddy who lived right out that bend. That's horrible.
Yeah.
That is awful. Weird. Go up 19. It's all right. We have in New Jersey. I come from New Jersey. A lot of bad roads. Horrible. Like Route 1 and Route 9 coming together. Traffic nightmare. That's down your neck of the woods.
China Parkway.
Oh,
Labor Day weekend.
parking lot. See, in New Jersey, depending on where you live, you may say, where do you live? By 137 on the Parkway. That was my exit.
Route 33.
Yeah. Different exits. You're by the exit. I'm up by the Paramus Mall, whatever that is, 161. I don't know if did they change it from numbers to miles? A lot of times they did.
I think it's still 161.
Just have quarters. That used to be our route. We'd go down to, pardon the expression, the Jersey Shore.
Yeah. 137.
Yeah.
I think that's where I am now.
But what?
Route 137.
Oh yeah. I was right by Galloping Hill Road. So this is the idea. So the loop, countercurrent flow because of this hairpin turn, that's very significant. And the vasa recta also have a countercurrent flow, but in the opposite direction. So think of it this way. The urine's coming like this, and the blood flow's going like that. So here's the blood coming in and the blood going out, going from arterial to venous blood, because that's where the energy is dissipated. And the urine's going this way. So you have opposite direction flows, and it creates this very interesting thing. So the single effect is the process by which active transport by solute, by pumps, that means energy, creates this concentration gradient. So water can't go through the thick segment in the ascending loop, so it depends on pumping out the solutes. So you're going to take and it's easier for me than you could read this as well as I could read to you to understand what goes on. But water always tries to equalize and will diffuse down from an area with more water, less solutes, to an area with less water, more solutes. I say the water cannot cross the wall of the ascending limb and can diffuse freely through the descending limb. So over time, and this is what I meant by from birth, since the medulla and the medullary interstitium inside the medulla, the fluid in the space between the cells has become more concentrated over time. And that's when babies and then infants and toddlers can begin to concentrate their urine. The net result of the single effect is to dilute filtrate in the ascending limb while concentrating the medulla, and to concentrate the filtrate in the descending limb by pulling it out. So it's, if you reread that, the net result of the single effect is to dilute the filtrate itself. You're diluting that because you're pulling out solutes up top, and you're pulling out fluid on the ascending limb and pulling out fluids on the descending limb. So with this constantly moving, okay, the countercurrent model is useful to imagine a series of discrete steps and then envision all of them happening the time. And the steps are salt from the filter. So if we think of it up top, ascending, which is sort of bass backwards. So you're thinking of it coming down. You said, well, it's flowing this way. The first thing we think about is losing the water. But for our purposes, let's think about, because in an infant, they get rid of the salt from the filtrate. Okay, they pump the salt out of the ascending limb. It equalizes with the water, and then they shift the filtrate along the tube. So start out at the same concentration, and as things start to move, we begin to see changes. And what you'll see is that the so-called single effect of one losing water, one losing salt, creates anywhere across. So if this is this tube shape, this sort of U shape, on one side of the U, the descending side is always about 200 milliosmoles greater than the ascending side. So you immediately start to create a gradient. And so this is just sort of summarizing this. Meanwhile, with the more dilute filtrate that was ascending limb gets pushed up, some of it moves out of the loop. And so it's just a continuing recycle. It's a very difficult concept to understand. And it's just the idea that this is something that develops over time and then is continually reinforced every time urine goes through. And so they're going through the number. And this is really just summarizing what I was telling you about that. So as a result, this is sort of what's happening from its, and if you want to read this through it, I don't, because it's just beginning to show you how this changes. And I'll reread it to see if I can give you any little nuggets that help it sort of stick it a little bit better. So steady supply of oxygen, nutrients, waste products removed. That's the exchanger involving those draped vessels going in the opposite direction, those capillaries. So they're not randomly organized because it would not be. So that hairpin loop really plays a major role in involving continuously moving out water and moving out solutes that are there. So the result of the blood in the ascending segment is diluted so that is only slightly more concentrated than the surrounding medulla, which leaves the vasa recta as horizontal segments that allow blood at a certain depth to move from the descending limb, the vasa recta, to a section of the ascending limb with the same concentration. And so this is kind of the mechanism of all of these. So they're basically osmotic movement supplemented by active transport, would maybe the best way to describe it. And so finally we get to the distal tubule, last stop. Now, to me, that's like final organization of the urine. We're going to now get rid of all the stuff that we need to get rid of, make sure we've brought back all the stuff we need to get back, make some subtle adjustments in pH and things like that. And with something called specific gravity, which has to do with a lot of the particles. Because urine, and which the brilliance of it is that urinalysis is a very easy snapshot into a lot of things. So you can get a whole idea of how well your kidneys are doing. If you're a diabetic, is it under control? Are you spilling proteins? Is there blood from a source that's in there? Is there, in fact, real quick one. So that's part, to me, that's part of the process. The distal tubule resorbs sodium and calcium, which we want to retain. And typically when sodium goes in one direction, potassium in the other, and then we balance the pH with protons and bicarbonate. The big players, most of the final water mechanisms are based hormonally. Okay, and the big players are vasopressin, antidiuretic hormone. Talks a little bit about that in endocrine. I'll do some more today. What that does is it inserts little channels in the distal tubule and the collecting ducts, which they lead into, that absorb water. So antidiuretic, makes you thirsty, tightens blood vessels because it's called vasopressin, and inserts those channels to pull water. Depending on how the pressure readings are when we get to the juxtaglomerular apparatus again, it will generate the renin-angiotensin aldosterone mechanism. And the principal way aldosterone works is it inserts little channels into that same area, just a convoluted tubule collecting ducts, and it pulls sodium. And we have Stein's. Mary had a little lamb rule, of course, where sodium goes, water is sure to follow. Rule. Mary had a little lamb. Her fleece was white as snow. It was white as snow everywhere that Mary went. The lamb was sure to go. It's a unusual tale. You can't say fairy tales is pejorative.
Did you
No. Yes. Tell you about it in advance.
Okay.
See, I know the question. Students used to come and I wrote, yes, not now, when I'm ready. Did you grade the exams? When are we going to find out the grade? When I'm ready. Just anticipate questions.
What happens when you drink alcohol? Because I know it absorbs into your blood, but then what occurs in the liver? Is it like the same thing as like what happens with water?
No, alcohol is different. Alcohol has a prodigious effect on the kidney because it inhibits antidiuretic hormone. And that's why when you're drinking, you typically have to go to the bathroom more. And it's because you have less antidiuretic hormone that's suppressed, so you're not retaining a lot of fluid. That's what makes alcohol bad in a lot of ways. Originally, it was used as a general anesthetic. They'd give people a bunch to drink, and it would throw off a lot of mechanisms. And most importantly, the level to operate was very, very close to the lethal level. If you gave somebody enough to drink, they wouldn't feel anything, but if you gave any more, they died.
Yeah.
It was very hard depending on the circumstances. So that's one of the things that occurs with alcohol. Alcohol puts an unusually high burden on your liver. And what happens in your liver, it has 2 steps of detoxification, which Dr. Hillwood tells you about. It goes from alcohol to acetaldehyde and then to acetic acid.
Yeah.
Acetaldehyde is very toxic. And so you can overwhelm that enzyme mechanism and create a lot of toxicity. Plus, alcohol is inherently toxic to liver cells. There's so much processing going on that continuous use causes significant damage over time. What does that mean? It means you have to become an alcoholic, not so much become an alcoholic, but to develop cirrhosis takes some work. Typically 10 years of constant drinking. What does that mean?
Like
What would be a constant drinker? 6-pack a night for 10 years? Bottle of whiskey every night for 10 years? Bottle of wine or 2 every night for 10 years?
Yeah.
It's about the time. If you do it for 2 years and stop, your liver's highly regenerative. Okay, and then there's other factors that are involved. I used to teach a course, it's off topic, and we're almost done anyway. In addictive diseases. When I first started to teach 25 years ago, they had me teaching a course called Drugs in the Human Body. I tried to bring it here for like non-majors, non-lab course. It's a really cool book that I'd used. And there's a lot of addictions that are there. And I'm an expert on addictions. I mean, I'm an addicted smoker. I never really was a drinker. Addicted to pain pills. Okay. And I had access. That's why doctors don't get, I'm going to tell tales out of school, why doctors don't give samples now of controlled substances. It's access. I got a headache. I'll just take a few pain pills. I'll take a few more. And I'll take a few more because you develop a tolerance. But there are different things that involve addiction. And for whatever reason, alcohol, even though it's by no means theoretically, it's not something you could self-addict in a day. Shooting heroin, smoking crack cocaine, those are things that you could addict right away. They're that intense. The high and the rapidity with it strikes your pleasure center. Alcohol takes time. It's good news. Once it's there, if you ask anybody who's polyaddicted, it takes forever. Alcohol is the hardest one to beat. If you're an alcoholic, don't ever drink again. If someone's alcoholic, there's no, well, I've got it under control. No, there's not. It's really difficult, and it's the one that is that's one of the few that where going cold turkey is potentially lethal because it's a depressant. You depress your central nervous system. So your central nervous system, to compensate for a depressed state, is highly sensitive. It lowers, think of it this way, it lowers the threshold for all action potentials. Now, if you suddenly withdraw it with that lowered potential, it's easy to get it hyperexcited. And so we get something called seizures. The DTs, delirium tremors, are a hyperexcitation due to the sudden withdrawal of alcohol. So in the old days, they throw a binge drinker in jail, cold turkey, no treatment program, and all of a sudden, oh, he's dead. Had the DT seized, died. See ya. So we're a lot more cognizant of that. So you have to do medically assisted withdrawals like that. When I use Chantix, which I would never recommend, to detox to stop smoking, and the pain pills I just didn't. Got to the point. And all this was about the same time, about 23 years ago. Smoking is 16 years in June. I'm not like my dad. Just threw away. A man of great willpower. Survived the depression, starving.